what we're doing for our series right now is we're going through the book of Mark, and I want you to think back and think about times you've looked at old pictures or old movies. Maybe this has happened to you. Maybe you were the victim in this situation, or maybe you were the perpetrator in this situation, but there's some old pictures that can be embarrassing, I would imagine, right? You know, the little 2-year-old kid, nothing but a diaper and a cowboy hat, chocolate all over their face, swinging a rubber chicken, and who knows what was going on behind that, but it was a cute picture at the time. And then later, like say their graduation party, that comes out, and that's a lot of fun, right? For some of us anyway, that's fun. But when you look at old pictures, sometimes you can remember, sometimes you can't, but it often brings up some good memories, right? Makes you think about those times or that special event that was, and it's a good memory. And as we look through the book of Mark here, our strategy has been to go chapter by chapter instead of section by section. So we're on chapter 6 today, and as I looked at this and tried to figure out what to talk about, I realized that the whole chapter was just filled with snapshots of very familiar stories that anybody that's read the Bible for any length of time or been involved in a church kind of situation, these are going to be very familiar snapshots, very familiar pictures to you. So those of you who are in that situation, I'm just going to kind of take a glance at the snapshot, talk about it, and hopefully it'll dredge up some good memories from you. Some times when the Lord spoke to you, or that you experienced that type of situation, and it can be good for you. Those of you who are not familiar with the Bible, hey, you're looking at someone else's family pictures and getting a smile with them, that kind of thing. So that's kind of the approach I'm going to take with this, because I saw that there's pretty much a theme in this chapter about trusting Jesus when it kind of doesn't make sense. There's some weird stuff that happens in this chapter that people had to kind of take pause and what's going on here, and okay, we'll do what he says, and things happen. So that's kind of the approach I'm going to take. So we're in Mark chapter 6, and I'm not going to read the whole chapter, obviously it's very long. I'm going to read some sections, and in other places I'll just kind of explain the snapshot, tell you the story so that you can see what's going on. So the first snapshot that happens is a situation where Jesus is put in a situation where he has to do some things, and his friends and his family think he's nuts. So that's our first situation to think about is, hey, how do we trust Jesus when our friends and our family don't believe us or doubt us or are causing questions in our lives? So I'm going to read that section of Scripture, and then we'll talk a little bit. This is verses 1 through 6 in Mark chapter 6. It says, "He went away from there and came to his hometown, and his disciples followed him. And on the Sabbath he began to teach in the synagogue. And many who heard him were astonished, saying, 'Where did this man get these things? What is the wisdom given to him? How are such mighty works done by his hands? Is not this the carpenter, the son of Mary, and his brother of James and Joseph and Judas and Simon? Are not his sisters here with us?' And they took offense at him. And Jesus said to them, 'A prophet is not without honor except in his hometown, and among his relatives and in his own household.' And he could do no mighty work there except that he laid his hands on a few sick people and healed them. And he marveled because of their unbelief. And he went about among the villages teaching." So here we see the picture of Jesus kind of going and do what he was doing, right? He was going around teaching people, doing some healings and things like that. Went to his hometown and began doing his thing. And all the people were there saying, "Who's this guy? Yeah, we know him, right? What's he think he's doing?" That word astonished is really kind of a mocking. It's like, "Hey, what's going on with you? What do you think you're doing?" And you can see it in their language. How did he get these teachings? And we know him. He's a carpenter. What's he telling us about God for? So Jesus was doing what God had his plan to do, right? To go teach and all those things and heal and bring the good news to people. So this is a little bit different for us because this is Jesus actually, but he's following God's directions. So if you want to imagine yourself in this boat, you're the one doing what God wants and you're listening to Jesus, right? So it's the same relationship in some sense, but it must have been worse for him, I would imagine, because he was Jesus doing those things. So here they are calling him out. Who do you think you are? How do you know anything? And what's your problem? They took offense at him, right? It wasn't just a simple ignoring. They took offense and they called him out. Actually, as I was reading for this, when they said, "Is this not the carpenter, the son of Mary?" What apparently was going on in the Jewish culture is you always referred to somebody by their fathers. "You're the son of Joseph," they should have said. These people all knew the story. There was, I'm sure, questions about Mary and Joseph and Jesus' birth, right? That whole thing. So that was actually an insult, what they were doing. They were calling him out as probably illegitimate when they did that. So not only did they not believe him, they were throwing down insults at him. So there's the situation for Jesus, right? He's doing what God wants him to do. Family doesn't believe him. Friends calling him a fool. What are you doing? And what did he have to do? He had to deal with that, right? So as we face those situations, we have to, I'm sure many of you have faced that actually, I would imagine, if you're following Jesus. What do you do? What would Jesus do? He kept teaching, but he said, you know what? Can't help you, right? And it's interesting here, it says he could do no mighty work there. You know, obviously he could physically do it, but given the circumstances, wasn't his thing. He wasn't going to do it. The power to do those miracles and to do those things that he was doing was not depending on the people. It was his interest level, I guess you want to say, or his willingness. And if you look at other gospels, actually a lot of these stories in this Mark chapter 6 are paralleled in other gospels. And if you look at them and try to compare and see how they went, you can see Jesus talking a little more openly. He's like, if you guys are not going to listen, I'm not going to stay here, basically. And he went about to other villages, is what he said. So he took his message and moved on. So here's the thought for us to take away. And again, we're just taking snapshots really quick and moving on. You're going to run into these situations, I would imagine. If you're following Christ, there's going to be people that don't want to listen, people that are close to you, and that's going to be hard. I mean, in other passages, his family came. This looks more like just the people in the town, but his family came and said he's out of his mind, right? There's going to be people close that are going to think you're out of your mind. It's going to happen. What do you do with that? Follow Jesus. Do what he did. Okay, sorry, but I got to do what God's got me to do and move on to other people that will listen. That's a tough thing to say, right? We don't want to leave our family behind. But God calls us to tell people what's going on, to do what he calls us to do. It's hard sometimes. So when we run into these situations where it doesn't make sense, because that actually, isn't that contrary to like normal thoughts? If people around you think you're crazy doing what you're doing, typically we're going to back off and say, well, wait, maybe I'm crazy. Okay? We have to look at who we're going to trust. We're going to trust Jesus, we're going to trust God, and we're going to trust the people around us. And that's not to discount the people around us. They've got a lot of good things to say, I'm sure. But when you know what God's got for you, you got to listen. It's hard. Not easy. This is the stuff that doesn't make sense, right? Next story, we turn to a place where Jesus calls his disciples and send them out. And what I noticed here is this kind of relates to us. This next snapshot is, how do you trust Jesus when the job you're doing doesn't make sense? When he's got you in a place where, what am I doing here? Has anybody ever felt that? Because I feel it on a regular basis. What am I doing with this job here? Okay? So how do we do that? Let's read this passage. It's verse 7 through 13 in Mark 6. I'll read this one. It says, and he called the 12 and began to send them out 2 by 2. And he gave them authority over the unclean spirits. He charged them to take nothing for their journey except a staff, no bread, no bag, no money in their belts, but to wear sandals and not put on 2 tunics. And he said to them, whenever you enter a house, stay there until you depart from there. And if any place will not receive you, and they will not listen to you, when you leave, shake off the dust that is on your feet as a testimony against them. So they went out and proclaimed that people should repent. And they cast out many demons and anointed with oil many who were sick and healed them. So this is again a familiar story to those of us who have heard these things before. So imagine hearing this before and relating it to something that's gone on in your life, and that hopefully can give you some benefit. But let's just examine this story here for a second. Jesus asked some pretty weird stuff of these guys. Go out and tell people what they don't want to hear and count on them to support you. That doesn't really equate, right? Jesus is obviously anticipating people saying go away, right? They don't want to hear it. When they do that, be done with them and move on, right? If they receive you, then stay there. But he's anticipating, and we all know, those of us who have tried to share this message with people, not everybody wants to hear it, right? So Jesus is telling them, don't prepare yourself. Don't take care of your physical needs. Go, tell people what they don't want to hear, and then hope they'll take care of you. That doesn't make sense, right? That is not the way that we function in life typically. But what did the disciples do? They went, right? They went and they did this stuff. They went out, they proclaimed. He gave them authority to cast out the demons. He gave them authority to heal people, right? They had success, and they came back and told them about it too. So that, from that snapshot, that's a life lesson right there, right? You're going to get some instructions that don't make sense from God. You're going to be asked to do stuff. A lot of the things he asks us to do don't make sense to the world. We're fools in the world's eyes in many ways, right? Scripture makes that clear. But, got to do it, right? When you do it, hey, you know what? He's going to be in the middle of that. And sometimes it doesn't seem like he's there. Sometimes we feel like we're out on our own, on a limb. No extra bread, no bag, no money in our belts. Wear sandals, don't put on 2 tunics. The 2 tunic thing there was pretty important. Their clothes, they had like 1 or 2 pairs of clothes, and they basically carried them wherever they went. Only take one. That one wears out, better hope someone gives you another one. Uh-oh, right? You know, this was not smart. And this wasn't like a go out for a day trip. They went for a while. This was a go stay with people kind of trip, okay? So we're going to run into that. And how do we handle it? I don't like this either, guys, but we got to trust him, right? It's hard. It's hard to put yourself out there and be in a place that, man, he's asking me to do something that really is contrary to every ounce of my sanity, every ounce of my wisdom of the world. But I got to do it because that's what he's telling me. Now, you got to be clear. Jesus was sitting there telling him what to do, right? We don't want to make these moves on emotion. We don't want to, hey, I think God would like me to go do X, Y, and Z. I'll give it a shot, right? You got to want to know what he's talking about. And that can be an adventure in and of itself, trying to figure out what he wants you to do in life, right? But in any case, when we know, we got to do. And that's what the disciples did, and it paid off for them. They saw the success of what Jesus promised. So I would offer that. When the world doesn't, or when your job doesn't make sense, unless he tells you to do something else, keep at it, right? And do it in a way that honors him. Do it in a way that would give you the opportunity to bring these messages to people and see what God does with it. Because we just don't know. Our sense is not his. We don't get it sometimes. Okay? And that's a hard message, but it is real. Next piece, next snapshot I want us to look at. And I'm not going to read this one. This one's too long to read here together. But it's verses 14 through 29. It's the story of John the Baptist and his death. Just a quick overview of that for you. Those of you who have seen the snapshot will remember. Those of you who haven't, you can read it certainly for yourselves, and it's accounted for in many of the Gospels. This is a big deal. John the Baptist, of course, is Jesus' cousin, and prepared the way for him to went out and preached in the wilderness and acted kind of crazy, and people came and listened, and then he pointed them to Jesus. So in the middle of that, the king, he was basically the Roman appointed ruler of that area. He wasn't really a king, he just called himself that. He was married, and then he decided, you know what? I think my brother's wife is of interest as well, and I'll marry her too. So he did. And this was not appropriate, as we know, and John the Baptist came and told him so in front of everybody. Hey, you can't do that. It's not right. And the king was kind of afraid of John the Baptist because he was doing some stuff and people were following him, so he didn't just flat out, most kings would have just killed him. That's kind of how that would work in that day. But he didn't because of whatever, and just the politics of the game. So, long story short, he has a big party. His wife's daughter, it's craziness, crazy story here, but basically performs a dance and gets a reward from the king, anything you want. So the mom says, hey, ask for John the Baptist's head. We got him now. So that's how they managed it. They pulled some political games and killed John the Baptist. So that's not a great snapshot to look at, obviously. The reason it comes up is this information was brought to him, and right here in this gospel, we don't get a lot of information. But when you look at the other Gospels, and in fact, when you look later in Mark in chapter 9, you can see how Jesus really did react to this. And in other places and in Mark 9, Jesus talks about John in glowing terms. He's the best prophet that ever lived, one of the greatest guys that ever lived. And these people did what they wanted to him. He was mad, rightfully so, right? So this topic would be about what do we do when we see injustice in the world? How do we trust Jesus when there's injustice? Because God's a God of justice, right? Why isn't this happening? And why do we see these kind of things if there's a loving God? That's a question that many of you have probably heard, right? So how do we deal with that? How do we trust God when it seems like life isn't fair or bad stuff happens to good people, to put it all those different words? That's a tough question. That is a hard question to handle. And I'm glad I'm just taking a snapshot here and not having to explain the whole thing, because it isn't an easy one. Pretty much we have to look at what Jesus did. Now, we know that Jesus at any point could have taken care of business, right? He told Pilate so. He could have, had angels at his command and taken care of things. He chose not to for his own life, obviously, when he was hanging on the cross. But even here, he could have taken vengeance for John the Baptist, who he loved dearly, was a family member, right? And who he regarded way up here amongst men, and was completely unjustly killed. He could have. He didn't. That's a lesson in and of itself when we see those things. Whatever God's plan was in this situation, Jesus let it go. He let things play out. When we take that stance of a loving God would, or there can't be a loving God because, that's very dangerous ground we're treading on. We need to consider that, because what we're really saying is, if I were God, I wouldn't let it happen that way. And that's never a good thing. I mean, there's times when I feel that way too, obviously. We all have those feelings, right? I wouldn't be bringing this up if I didn't know that we all felt like injustice was a bad thing, okay? So we all understand that we don't like it when bad things happen to good people. But when we start taking that kind of next step of let's fix it, or let's tell God how to do it right, boy, that when you really, if you aren't involved in that, if you're watching someone else, it's really easy to say, hey, that's pretty arrogant. How prideful of you to think you're God. But we all do that too. I've done it. I've definitely done that, right? You need to take a step back from yourself too and say, hold on. His ways are higher than my ways. I don't understand this, and that's okay, right? One of the fallacies of our Western culture especially is we think there's an explanation for everything, and we want it now. We're not willing to wait, and we're not willing to admit lots of times that we don't understand things. And it's just the nature of the way our philosophies have developed over the years and things like that when we see things like injustice and what we call unfair, boy, it rubs us wrong. And you know what? That's okay. I'm glad it does. I'm glad we're not happy to see people treated poorly. But when we start to think that we should take action in a sense that because God and we're God, not we're God, but if God were here, he would do, that's just a bad way. Because you know what? God is here, and he could do, and he chose not to, and I don't know why that is. And we need to be willing to say, I don't know why. Do you think Jesus was not a little bit perplexed about why this great guy John got his head chopped off? I bet he was. It doesn't say specifically about that, but he definitely commented negatively about it. And the way he phrases it is they did whatever they pleased. He was mad. He was not taking this in stride. So we have to kind of learn a lesson from Jesus on that one. Sometimes we have to take things that we think are unfair, know God's in charge, and go, okay, right? And that's a hard lesson to hear, right? It's a hard lesson to hear, but what's definitely wrong in that is to take things in our own hands and to act like we are God. So just give you a heads up on that when you start down that's unfair and a loving God would path, you're putting yourself in his place, and yeah, it's never a good place to be, because we can't handle it. Those times when we think we got it, we don't. And those times that we start thinking about how it should be, think about, we're here at Kids Day, right? Think about if a little 5-year-old kid started telling you how your car should run, right? Or, those of us who are parents, I know I've experienced this. I won't name any of my children, that's always unfair, but when you're doing something in the house and the little person comes along and says, you should do it this way, and they have no clue, that's us to God. In fact, here's that little kid and here's us. The gap between us and God is immeasurable compared to that. So when we start telling God how to do his business, take a breath, right? And then imagine those things. I will share this story. I remember my oldest was about 1.5. He was just starting to stand and walk and stuff. He was sitting on my lap. I've shared this story before. I don't know if many of you have heard it or not. He was sitting on my lap. He stood up, and he was trying to stand, and he couldn't. So I was holding him up, and he kept pushing me off, and he'd keep falling. And that was one of the very first lessons I got from being a parent about how different we are from God, because this little guy was trying to stand up and couldn't. I'm like, hey, dummy, you're going to fall, right? Here, let me hold you. Nope, he kept pushing me off, right? And how much we do that with God, we keep pushing him off when he's trying to hold us up. And it was a really good lesson for me about how, as parents, we can see, looking at our kid who's so simple, little, young, childish, how God must look at us and feel the same way. So, and more so, right? Because he's God and we're not. So when you get those inclinations to tell God how to do his business, think about that, and that might help you get through it sometimes. So the next snapshot I want to go to is a very familiar story, the feeding of the 5,000. So this makes us think about how do we trust God when resources are scarce, or there's just not enough of whatever we're trying to do. So let me read this one to you. Actually, no, I'm not going to read this one. It's again, too long. The basic concept here is that, and it's actually interesting, the prelude to this is worth a sermon in and of itself, I think, but at the end of the disciples going out and doing their thing, they came back and told Jesus, and he said, you know what, you guys are tired, let's go take a break. And they tried to get away, and the crowds followed them, and they couldn't get away from him. And in that light is when the feeding of the 5,000 happened. Jesus had mercy on the crowd, and he fed them, basically. But the story is actually one of the more humorous ones, I think, in the Bible. Jesus said, we got to feed these people, and the disciples are like, what are we going to do? There's 5,000. It was 5,000 men, so probably anywhere from 15 to 20,000 people are the estimates, because the word there is literally men, so it was just the men. So their families and everything were following them, probably. That's the expectation. So 10, 15, 20, whatever, just a ginormous amount of people, right? Inconceivable you would just be walking around the countryside and be able to feed these people, okay? And Jesus said, feed them. What are you talking about? And if you watch the interplay with them, it's kind of humorous. They're like, what do you want us to do? You know, go spend 6-8 months' wages on food for people in 5 minutes? How are we going to do that? He's like, you got anything? Go feed them. And they, of course, got the 2 loaves and the 5 fishes. Did I get that right? I don't remember. Let me look at the other way around. A little bit of food, whatever it was, right? A little bit of food, and okay, Jesus, I can only imagine their faces. I know I absolutely would have been, it's this guy's problem, right? Whatever. Boy, he showed them, didn't he? Everybody got food, and then, ironically, I'm sure it was an accident, there were 12 basketfuls of food left over. One for each of the doubting disciples to pick up, right? What a story, great snapshot. So how do we learn from this? Every single time you think you don't have enough, think about that story. He will provide. I don't know how, neither did they. That was an absurdity, right? Who knows what he did to do that? That's him being God. And there are times in your life you're going to face that. There's not enough to do X. Now, you need to make sure X is something you need to do, right? The brand new Mercedes might not be what you need to do. I don't know. But, lots of times it's real stuff. I can't pay my mortgage. Utility bills are coming up. I don't have it due. Stuff like that. That's very real for a lot of people. And you know what? Sometimes you're not going to have enough. That might happen. People have suffered. People have died in Scripture, and that's real. People of real faith have had bad things happen to them. It doesn't always work out. But if you don't trust God in it, I can pretty much assure you it's probably not going to work out. Right? If you try to do it yourself, imagine if those disciples had tried to do that themselves. What would they have done, really? They had a good question. What are we going to do? They didn't have the money. They didn't have the resources. They were out in the middle of the fields. It wasn't even like they were in town. Right? There was a town nearby, but it wasn't like it was a 5-minute affair to feed 5,000 people, or whatever, how many it was. And really, what were they going to do? And many of you may have been in that situation. What am I going to do here? And you just got to ask God, and he will help you figure it out. He will work it out. He got them started, right? You got a little bit, get started with that, right? Whatever it is, use what he's given you, get started with it, see what he does. That's my best advice to you. I'm certainly in no position to tell you how to fix these situations, but I am in a position to tell you this is what Jesus did. This is what the disciples did, right? They were walking with him, right? If you're walking with him, a little different, obviously, the physical walking versus the spiritual walking. But when those times come up, look to him. What should the disciples have done? Hey, you guys go feed them. Okay, how are we going to do that? What do you got for us, Jesus? How are we going to do it? That's really what they should have done, right? Not, what do you want us to do? I mean, when you look at it, if you guys go home and read that, you'll see it was a very much, you're crazy, what do you think we're going to do here kind of conversation, okay? So, but really, it should have been more of a sincere, okay, well, you're telling us to do it. How should we do that? You got something? Yep, use that. Okay, and there we go. There's the fish, right? That's how that should have gone. I'm 100% sure I would not have done that. I'm telling you what you should do. That doesn't mean I can do it any better than you can. But that's what we see in Scripture, is that this is the approach. When God has you in a situation where you can't do anything for yourself, and it seems like there's nothing there, whatever you've got, give it to him and let him multiply it, let him use it. That would be my advice, okay, when we see that. A lot of these things, like I said, they're snapshots of familiar stories, so I would imagine all of us have been in a situation where it seemed impossible. It seemed like, wow, I can't do that. And I've been in them too, and nothing this drastic, obviously. I doubt any of us have seen food multiply out of nowhere, but we've been in situations where this doesn't seem like it's going to work out, and it does. God makes it work out in ways that you don't expect. I'll give you a good example. Actually, you're all sitting in one right now. This building, okay? When this church started, we were meeting in a hotel. We ended up meeting for a while in the Polish Community Center on Albany or Washington Avenue Extension. And that was some fun because we never knew which room we were in, whether we were going to be in the bar or the bowling alley. Yes, we had church in a bowling alley. I have the videos to prove it, if you don't believe me. So craziness, right? And we started trying to find a place to actually permanently reside, and we didn't have any money. And we looked at this place. Lisa and I moved here almost 18 years ago now. We were part of another church. This church didn't even exist. And we looked at this and said, and that church didn't have a building either. This would be a great place for a church. Ha, ha, ha. That church didn't have any money either, okay? So this church, River of Life, had no cash, no way to buy a building like this especially. And the pastor and a couple of us looked at it and said, that'd be pretty cool. Called the people, see how much it was. Absurd. Not very long after that, a gentleman from Georgia with a church that was working for us called us and said, you got any buildings in mind? Well, we were looking at one. I'll give you $300,000 for the down payment. So you guys are sitting in an example of this right here, okay? Many of you didn't know that story probably, okay? So it's good to look back at snapshots sometimes and hear those stories, right? So when you doubt about resources, put it in God's hands and see what happens. And we were by no means super spiritual. We didn't expect that at all. We said, nah, we're not doing that when we saw this building, right? But God saw differently. So, he multiplied. He actually did the impossible. He multiplied from 0 and gave us something. I'm a math teacher. That's not possible. So it's truly God, truly God. So the last snapshot I want to look at, this is by far the craziest one, okay? This one is, how do you trust God when weird opportunities present themselves? Just stuff that can't possibly be right. This is the story. Now, I'm going to read this story, but Mark shortens it, and when we get to the point where he could have carried it on, other Gospels pick it up. I'll read from there as well. So this is verse 45 to 52 of Mark 6. Immediately, he made his disciples get into the boat and go. This is right after he fed the 5,000. Immediately, he made his disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side, to Bethsaida, where he dismissed the crowd. And after he had taken leave of them, And after he had taken leave of them, he went up to the mountains to pray. And when evening came, the boat was out on the sea, and he was alone on the land. And he saw that they were making headway painfully, for the wind was against them. And about the 4th watch of the night, he came to them, walking on the sea. He meant to pass by them, but when they saw him walking on the sea, they thought it was a ghost and cried out, for they all saw him and were terrified. But immediately he spoke to them and said, "Take heart, it is I, do not be afraid." And he got into the boat with them, and the wind ceased, and they were utterly astounded, for they did not understand about the loaves, but their hearts were hardened. I'm going to continue on in a second with another piece, but first of all, if you recall, I think it was Mark chapter 4, he calmed the storms, right? How are they astounded? He already did this stuff, right? And again, I am so glad I wasn't one of these guys. Their goofiness and mistakes are recorded for all of us to look at. We should never, ever attack them for their lack of faith, because I assure you most of us would have been jumping out of the boat in fear, not just saying, hey, who is that? Okay, but these poor guys got their mistakes recorded for history. So one thing that occurs to me is how did he just did this, a few weeks before he had calmed the seas, but here they are being surprised again. But actually, Matthew 14 gives us a full story out of this. In this, when he said, "Take heart, it is I, do not be afraid," Matthew 14, and Peter answered him, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." And he said, "Come." So Peter got out of the boat and walked on the water and came to Jesus. When he saw the wind, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me." And Jesus immediately reached out his hand, took hold of him, saying to him, "O you of little faith, Why do you doubt? And when they got into the boat, the wind ceased. And those in the boat worshipped him, saying, Truly you are the Son of God. So that's the walking on the water story that we're all, even if you've never been part of a church or anything, everybody's heard about Jesus walking on the water. Okay, so that's a pretty common snapshot we can look back at. So let's look at the situation here. The guys were doing their job, right? He told them, go across the lake. I don't know what they expected. They left him there. Was he going to walk around and meet him? Who knows? We don't get the details there. But he was up praying. And then they're rowing across, and the winds are blowing. They're having a hard time. It says they were making headway painfully, rowing against the wind, right? Or sailing. I don't know how they did it, whatever their method of getting there was. But it wasn't working out. It was hard, right? They were struggling. And here we see the dude walking on the water. I mean, you want to talk weird, that's got to be at the top of the list, I would think, right? That's not something that you're going to see every day, as they say, right? So their initial reaction to this, if you look at it, was fear. And I get that, right? What was that walking on the water? That can't be something natural, right? They'd probably been okay with a shark or something. Oh, we've seen that before. I don't know if there's sharks in that water, but you know what I'm saying. Some sort of water monster or treacherous reef or something. They're okay with that. But this guy's walking on the water, and they didn't know it's a guy, right? It's dark, windy. Who knows what that is out there, but it's something on top of the water, and that shouldn't be. So they were afraid. But when they listened to him, he said he saw that fear in them. Thank God for seeing the fear in our hearts, right? And he said, hey, it's me, don't be afraid. And there went the peace, or there went the fear, and the peace came, right? Now, it's funny to me that they didn't even ask. They just were afraid. They didn't even say, hey, what is that out there? They just kind of got afraid. And it was Jesus' initiative to help them with that. And that's probably pretty common for us, too. When weird things happen, we probably don't, on first instinct, go, God, what are you doing? It's more like, oh, no, what's that, right? And that's probably natural, too. Look for God in those things, right? When weird stuff is happening that doesn't really make sense around you, why is this going on? Hey, maybe God's in that. Listen for him. He might be talking to you. He might be saying, don't be afraid, that's me doing that. Okay, listen to that. So that's the lesson we get from Mark, but I really want to talk about Peter for a second, because this is something. That man got out of the boat and walked on water. That's crazy. I know for a fact I would not have had the faith to do that. Everybody always looks at Peter like, oh, afterwards, look, he got afraid and fell in. He was already out there, right? He was already out there. Boy, you talk about trusting Jesus. Now, I can swim. I don't mind getting wet. I don't even think I would be afraid to fall in off a boat out in the middle of a lake where I couldn't touch. I'd be able to get back to the boat or whatever. It's okay. Some people might be terrified by that, and that's okay too. That's not irrational. That's okay to be afraid of falling in the water. Peter's a fisherman, so I'm sure he'd fallen in before, right? The fear wasn't the fact that he's getting out to walk on the water, right? When things happen, when weird stuff happens, you might want to take advantage of it. How many people in history can say they walked on water? Jesus and Peter, as far as we know, right? At least maybe someone else did that, it's not recorded, but that's a pretty cool experience, I would imagine, right? Think about what all the other disciples missed out on. They didn't trust Jesus in that. They just got afraid, and okay, they were at peace once they said it was him, but Peter got out and did something pretty cool, right? And yes, in the middle of it, he got afraid and fell in, and you know what? That's going to happen too, okay? But if you get out of that boat, hey, look what God did, okay? So out of all of these things, the idea I want you to get, hopefully, is that when stuff happens in your life, Jesus is going to be involved. He's going to help you trust him. I would like to do a little demonstration. I need a volunteer from the audience. This is Kids Day, so I got the volunteers already. Here's the thing, though. You got to be willing to trust me. Christian, you trust me? Come on up, boss. Why don't you get up here on this stool? Christian, did I tell you you could come up here today? Did I tell you you were coming up here today? No, he doesn't know what's going on here. Get on the stool. So trusting, right? Trusting is hard to do. What are you doing? No, get up on the stool. There you go. Stand right up on it. That's how it works. Okay. Is that pretty far down? Kinda. If I hold your hands, will you jump down? Let's do it. Give me your hands. There you go, jump. You're okay with that, right? Get back up there. Turn around, face the screen. Will you fall backwards and I'll catch you? Do it. Go ahead. Come on, man. Come on. I know. Trust me. I will not drop you. I will not drop you. Go. There we go. All right. Big hand for our assistant. Right? You guys all know where I'm going with that. Trusting. Now, he's my next door neighbor. We're good friends. He trusts me, right? I hope my kids would have come up here. Why don't you raise your hand, boy? Yeah. All right? But I wouldn't have done that with a kid I didn't know, because I wouldn't expect him to trust me, right? That's appropriate. Adults in the room, you've seen that game before, right? It's hard to do that. You could see he was wavering. He trusted me, right? But that's tough to fall backwards where you can't see. The first time I did that on purpose, he could see, here we are, easy enough to do that, right? Anybody would do that, jump down and this isn't that far for us. For him, it's probably pretty far. But, it's easy to trust when we can see where we're going to land, right? When we've already got it figured out, that's pretty simple. Most of us would do that. Might take a breath. Maybe if you're afraid of heights, you might have to really think about it. I am. I don't know if I'd be doing that stuff, but, you can manage to do that. For him to turn around and not know what's coming, that takes trust. We are in that boat a lot with Jesus, guys. Lots of times, all those things we just looked at, a lot of that doesn't make sense to us, to the world. We saw his family doubting him. There are going to be times when you have to just lean back and let him grab you. That's hard to do that. But I would encourage you to do so, because maybe you'll walk on water.